Elias Thorne thought he was saving a desperate soul when he hired Clara to muck out the stalls, needing a strong back more than he needed a friend in his old age. But 3 days later, the silence of the ranch house felt heavy, wrong. Elias crept toward his study, hand hovering near his holster, only to freeze. Clara wasn't working the fields. She was standing over his open ledger, trembling as she traced the columns of blood money he had buried 20 years ago. She didn't just know how to read. By the look of terror in her eyes, she knew exactly who he really was. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The wind didn't just blow through Blackwood Valley, it mourned, sweeping over the cracked earth and peeling paint of a ranch that had long forgotten the sound of laughter. Elias Thorne sat on his porch, a relic of a harder time, watching the sun dip below the ridge like a dying ember. His hands, once steady enough to shoot a coin from the air at 50 paces, now trembled with a dull, aching betrayal, the knuckles swollen like old nuts in oak wood. He stared at the collapsed section of the corral fence, the wood gray and rotting, a testament to a kingdom falling into ruin because the king was too weak to hold the hammer. He tried to lift the saddle near the rail, his fingers curling around the leather, but his breath hitched as a jagged bolt of pain shot up his spine, a cruel, undeniable reminder that the frontier had no mercy for the old. He needed hands, strong hands, not for the gun, not anymore, but for the shovel and the plow. That cold desperation was what drove him into town, a place he usually avoided like a fever, where he found her standing by the livery stable, looking less like a worker and more like a ghost the wind had blown in. Clara. That was the name she gave, spoken so soft he almost missed it beneath the stampede of town life. She looked frail, her dress too big for her frame, her eyes wide and holding a quiet kind of terror that Elias knew well from the faces of men facing the gallows. He almost rode past. A girl like that belonged in a schoolhouse, or safe behind a general store counter, not mucking out stalls in the shadow of the mountains. But when she looked up, he didn't see pity. He saw hunger that hollered out the soul. He nodded once, the only contract they needed. The ride back was silent, the only sound the rhythmic thud of hooves and the creak of leather, a silence that settled over the ranch house like a heavy, suffocating blanket. For 3 days, he watched her from the safety of the shadows. He watched as she hauled water buckets that would have broken men twice her size, her small boots sinking into the mud, her jaw set in a grim line of determination that violently contradicted the innocent ribbons in her hair. She didn't speak. She didn't complain. She simply worked until her hands bled and the sun surrendered to the twilight. Elias stood by the study window, nursing a cup of bitter coffee, a strange feeling rising in his chest, not suspicion, not yet, but a grudging respect for a strength that didn't match the wrapper. He saw the way she wiped sweat from her brow with a trembling hand, how she paused to look at the horizon with a longing that mirrored his own regrets. The valley was quiet, but for the first time in 20 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like the calm before a storm, a breath held before the plunge, as the old man and the girl moved around each other like ghosts in a graveyard, unaware that the past was already clawing its way up through the floorboards to meet them. The storm didn't arrive with a polite knock. It crashed against the valley walls like a stampede of wild stallions, the thunder shaking the very foundation of the ranch house until the floorboards sang in a dissonant, creaking harmony. Outside, the sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple, obliterating the moon and leaving the world to be swallowed by a heavy, suffocating darkness. Inside, the air grew thick and still, the kind of pressure that builds behind the eyes before a migraine sets in. Elias Thorne sat in his high-backed leather chair by the dying hearth, the embers casting long, dancing shadows that looked too much like the ghosts he had spent 20 years trying to outride. His body, worn down by the friction of time and hard labor, finally surrendered to the exhaustion that had been gnawing at his bones for weeks. His chin dipped to his chest, his breathing deepening into a rasping rhythm that matched the wind howling through the eaves. He slept, but it wasn't the peaceful rest of the innocent. It was the shallow, twitching slumber of a man who slept with one ear cocked for the sound of a twig snapping, a man who kept his Colt Navy revolver not in a drawer, but on the small table within arm's reach, the metal cold and comforting against the wood. The house settled into a deceptive quiet beneath the roar of the storm, the only sound inside being the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting away seconds that Elias didn't know were numbered. Down the hallway, the floorboards groaned under a weight much lighter than Elias's heavy boots. Clara moved through the gloom, a wraith in the flashes of lightning that illuminated the corridor in stark, strobe light bursts. She wasn't heading for the kitchen or the back door. Her eyes were fixed on the one door Elias had explicitly forbidden her to touch, the heavy oak slab at the end of the hall that led to his study. For 3 days, she had sensed the gravitational pull of that room. It wasn't just a locked door. It was a wound that refused to close, a place that smelled of stale tobacco and secrets that had curdled into poison. She paused, her hand hovering over the brass knob, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The storm outside masked the sound of the latch clicking open, a sharp metallic snap that would have woken a younger man. But Elias remained slumped in his chair, lost in a dream of smoke and fire. Clara slipped inside, and the air in the room felt significantly colder, stagnant, as if time had stopped in this specific square footage 2 decades ago. The study was a mausoleum of papers and dust. She moved toward the desk, her fingers trailing over the rough edge of the wood. There was no gold here, no hidden stash of currency that a common thief would hunt for. But Clara wasn't looking for money. Her eyes locked onto the large, leather-bound book sitting in the center of the desk, its cover cracked and worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. It was the only clean thing in the room, free of dust, suggesting it was handled often, perhaps obsessively. With trembling hands, she opened the cover. The spine cracked, a sound like a dry bone breaking in the silence. She struck a match, the flare of sulfur brief and blinding, before lighting the kerosene lamp on the desk, turning the wick down low until it cast just enough light to read by. The ink was faded, turning from black to a rusty brown that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. She began to read, her finger tracing the columns. It wasn't just numbers. It was a ledger of transactions, yes, but the currency wasn't cattle or grain. It was silence. August 14, 1884, payment for transport via Deadwood. September 3, 1884, silence regarding the incident at Silver Creek. The names listed next to the payments weren't business partners, they were widows. Orphans. Clara stopped breathing. Her finger froze on a specific line, the ink blurring as tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. The entry was simple, bureaucratically even, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. She recognized the date. She recognized the location. And she recognized the handwriting. It was the meticulous, jagged script of a man trying to maintain order in a chaotic world, a man trying to balance a moral debt that could never be paid. She flipped the page, desperate to be wrong, but the evidence mounted with every column. This wasn't a rancher's logbook. It was a confession written in codes and numbers. It was the architectural blueprint of a massacre that had destroyed her childhood, carefully catalogued by the man snoring in the other room. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, buckling her knees. She gripped the edge of the desk, the wood biting into her palms, her knuckles white. The terror wasn't just about what he had done, it was about who he was. The kindly old man who had offered her work, who had shared his coffee, was the keeper of the grave where her family's reputation lay buried. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. The storm outside seemed to vanish, replaced by a ringing silence that screamed danger. The hairs on the back of Clara's neck stood up. She didn't need to turn around to know she wasn't alone anymore. In the doorway, the shadow had detached itself from the darkness. Elias Thorne stood there, the sleep gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, predatory clarity that belonged to a much younger, much more dangerous man. He didn't look frail now. He looked like iron forged in a bad fire. His right hand was raised, the heavy barrel of the Colt Navy leveled squarely at her chest. The hammer was already pulled back, the mechanical click of it echoing in the small room like a gavel striking a judge's bench. There was no waver in his aim. This was the posture of a man who had resolved himself to do a terrible thing to keep a terrible secret. "I told you," Elias whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering over stone, "that this room was for the dead." He took a step forward, the floorboard whining in protest. He saw the book open. He saw where her hand rested. He saw the recognition in her face. In that split second, the narrative of his life, the carefully constructed lie of the harmless hermit rancher, shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He tightened his grip on the trigger. He had killed men for less. He had killed men to protect what was written in that book. It should have been easy. Just a squeeze of the finger, a flash of light, and the secret would be safe again. But then he looked, really looked, at her. He didn't see a thief. He didn't see a thread. He saw her trembling, not with a fear of death, but with the devastation of betrayal. He saw the tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She wasn't looking at the gun. She was looking at him, her eyes searching his soul and finding only rot. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring, the tension vibrating in the air between the barrel of the gun and the beating of her heart. He had thought he was hiring a farmhand to help him die in peace. Instead, he was staring down the barrel at his own judgment day. He exhaled, a shaky, ragged sound, his finger hovering over the trigger, caught in the purgatory between the killer he used to be and the man he wanted to believe he had become. The hammer of the cult navy lowered with a mechanical click that sounded louder than the thunder rolling across the plains, a sharp, metallic finality that severed the immediate threat of violence but did nothing to dispel the suffocating dread filling the room. Elias didn't holster the weapon, his hand, heavy with age and the trembling legacy of a sinful life, simply dropped to his side, the barrel pointing harmlessly at the floorboards that were stained with the same dust and grime as his soul. He didn't look at Clara, not yet. He couldn't bear the judgment burning in her eyes, a judgment that felt too much like the God he had stopped praying to 20 years ago. Instead, he moved with a slow, painful gait toward the heavy oak door, his boots scraping against the wood, and turning the iron key in the lock, the bolt sliding home with a delphig that transformed the study from a sanctuary into a cell. The air in the room grew instantly stale, thick with the smell of old paper, kerosene, and the sharp, acrid scent of fear, both hers and his. He leaned his back against the door, the wood cool against his spine, and finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "Who sent you?" The question wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, stripped of all bluster, a naked demand for truth in a room built on lies. Clara didn't flinch, though her hands were shaking so violently they threatened to tear the fragile pages of the ledger beneath them. She didn't answer immediately, the silence stretching out, filled only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the darkened window pane. "I asked you a question, girl," Elias rasped, his voice cracking. "A man doesn't come to a place like this, doesn't keep a book like that, without enemies. Did Vane send you? Or the marshal?" Clara shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cost her immense effort. "No one sent me," she said, her voice barely audible, yet hitting Elias with the force of a physical blow. "I came for work, but I stayed. Because of the writing." She traced a finger down the column of figures, her touch reverent and horrified. "My father taught me to read," she continued, her eyes never leaving Elias's face, pinning him to the door. "He didn't have books. He had letters. Letters from a man who claimed to be a business partner. A man who wrote his G's with a loop that looked like a hangman's noose." Elias felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and hollow. He knew that loop. He had practiced it for years, a flourish of vanity in a profession of invisible crimes. "You're a Williams girl," Elias breathed, the realization washing over him like ice water. It wasn't a question. The resemblance was suddenly, painfully clear, the set of the jaw, the defiance in the eyes, the quiet dignity that refused to be extinguished by fear. "He didn't steal that gold," Clara said, her voice gaining strength, the tremors in her hands ceasing as anger took the reins. "They said he was the inside man. They said he orchestrated the robbery and ran off with the share. They hung his name before they even found his body." Elias closed his eyes, the darkness behind his lids instantly populating with the ghosts he had kept at bay with whiskey and isolation. "The Silver Creek Massacre." It wasn't a robbery, it was a slaughter. He could still hear the screams over the roar of the river, the chaotic gunfire that had erupted not because of resistance, but because the gang, Silas Vane's gang, didn't want witnesses. Elias hadn't pulled a trigger that day. He had sat in the carriage, clutching this very ledger, his knuckles white, listening to the massacre unfold with the detachment of a coward. He was the accountant, the man who made the blood money disappear into clean columns and legitimate investments. He was the one who laundered the sins of violent men until they looked like respectable prophets. "I didn't kill him," Elias whispered, the confession tasting like ash. "I never killed any of them." "But you wrote the names," Clara countered, her finger stabbing the page. "You wrote the numbers. You knew." The accusation hung in the air, undeniable and damning. This was the internal dilemma that had rotted Elias from the inside out for 2 decades. He wasn't the butcher, but he was the one who sharpened the knives. He had kept the ledger not as a trophy, but as insurance, a foolish, desperate hope that one day he would find the courage to walk into a marshal's office and lay it on the desk, to trade his own freedom for the truth. But courage was a currency Elias had spent years ago. He looked at the ledger, the book he had guarded with his life, the book that contained the coordinates of the buried strongbox and the names of every man who had ridden with Vane that day. He had told himself he was protecting the evidence, waiting for the right moment, for a time when the law wasn't bought and paid for by the very men listed in those pages. But looking at Clara, seeing the wreckage of a life his silence had helped destroy, he knew the truth. He hadn't been waiting for justice, he had been hiding from it. He was paralyzingly afraid, afraid of Vane, afraid of the news, afraid of the world knowing that Elias Thorne, the quiet rancher, was the architect of the valley's greatest tragedy. The gun in his hand felt impossibly heavy now, a useless tool against the weight of the past. He pushed off the door, his legs feeling like lead, and walked to the window, staring out into the black abyss of the storm. "The gold isn't gone, Clara," he said, his voice hollow, talking to the reflection of the old man in the glass. "And neither are the men who took it. You think reading that book gives you power? It puts a target on your back the size of this ranch." He turned back to her, his face etched with a sorrow so deep it looked like erosion. "I kept it to make things right," he lied, or perhaps he was trying to convince himself. "I was going to turn it in." "When?" Clara asked, her voice cutting through his defenses. "When everyone who remembered was dead." The question lingered, unanswerable. Elias looked at the ledger, the leather binding cracked like his own resolve. He had spent 20 years being the gatekeeper of the truth, but he had never opened the gate. Now, the daughter of the man he framed was standing in his study, holding the key to his destruction, and for the first time in 20 years, Elias didn't feel the urge to run. He felt the crushing, suffocating weight of an opportunity he didn't deserve, the chance to stop being the accountant of death and start paying his debts. He looked at the locked door, then back at Clara. The storm outside was raging, but the real storm was right here, in the quiet space between an old coward and a girl who refused to let the truth stay buried. "Read it all," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, surrendering to the inevitable. "Read every name. Because if you're going to die for this, you should know exactly who you're dying for." The tension in the room didn't break, it solidified, shifting from the sharp panic of violence to the heavy, concrete dread of a pack formed in the shadow of the gallows. The ghost of Deadwood wasn't a spirit haunting the halls, it was the man standing by the window, and tonight, the haunting was finally over. The reckoning had begun. While the storm had battered the ranch into a submissive silence, the town of Silverton, 10 miles east, woke to a different kind of disturbance, a quiet, creeping unease that arrived on the back of a pale gray gelding. The rider, Silas Vane, didn't look like a ghost from a violent past. He looked like the future, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than the saloon he was stepping into, with silver spurs that chimed a polite, rhythmic warning with every step. Vane moved with the fluid grace of a man who had long ago decided that the laws of God and men were merely suggestions. He wasn't the wild, desperate outlaw he had been 20 years ago. Tom had refined him, polished the rough edges of his brutality until it shone like marble. He tipped his hat to a passing woman, his smile quick and dazzling, masking eyes that assessed the street with the cold calculation of a butcher eyeing a herd. He believed the past was dead and buried, literally. He believed the ledger, that damning book of names and numbers, had been reduced to ash in a fire he had set himself 2 decades prior. But whispers were a stubborn thing in the West. They traveled on the wind, carrying fragments of stories about an old man in the valley who still paid for supplies with gold coins minted before the war. Vane walked into the dusty interior of the general store, the bell above the door announcing him with a cheerful chime that felt obscenely out of place. He wasn't there for supplies. He leaned against the counter, his movements languid, peeling an apple with a knife that was just a little too sharp, a little too ready. "I'm looking for an old friend," Vane said, his voice a smooth baritone that vibrated with false warmth. "Goes by the name of Thorne. Elias Thorne. Heard he might be running a spread out near the ridge." The storekeep, a man who had survived the frontier by knowing when to talk and when to play deaf, hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. Vane didn't threaten him. He didn't need to. He simply stopped peeling the apple and looked up, his smile remaining fixed while the warmth in his eyes evaporated completely. It was a look that promised violence without lifting a finger, a psychological flang that left the storekeeper stammering directions. Vane tossed a coin on the counter, payment for information, or perhaps a down payment on a funeral, and turned to leave, satisfied. He didn't want to kill Elias. In a twisted, complicated way, he loved the old man like a brother. They had ridden together, bled together. But Vane was a businessman now, and loose ends were bad for business. If Elias was still breathing, Vane would fix that. Not with anger, but with the necessary, tragic efficiency of a man pruning a withered branch to save the tree. 10 miles away, under the heavy timber beams of the ranch house kitchen, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. The gun was gone, tucked away in a drawer, but its presence lingered like the smell of cordite. Elias sat at the rough-hewn table, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands, staring at Clara as if seeing her for the first time. The ledger lay between them, a demilitarized zone of leather and paper. The morning light filtered through the dust motes, illuminating the exhaustion etched into both their faces. They were no longer employer and farmhand. They were conspirators bound by a terrifying truth. "You handled that book like you wrote it," Elias murmured, his voice rough with the debris of the night's revelations. Clara didn't look up from the page she was studying. "My father was William Halloway," she said, the name landing in the room like a stone dropped in a deep well. Elias flinched. He remembered William, the bank clerk with the ink-stained fingers and the nervous tick in his left eye, the man who had opened the vault not because he was greedy, but because Vane had held a knife to his throat. "He didn't run," Clara continued, her voice trembling with a suppressed rage that was far older than she was. "The papers said he took the money and fled to Mexico. They said he built a villa on the coast while the town starved." She looked up then, her eyes wet but fierce. "He never left the county. I know because I found his spectacles in the river mud a week later." Elaine scraped his mug tighter, his knuckles turning white. He knew this part of the story. He had written the entry that paid the sheriff to ignore the spectacles. He had cataloged the cost of erasing a man's existence. "But that's not how I know the book," Clara said, reaching into the pocket of her apron and pulling out a worn, folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table. "For 5 years after he died, my mother received letters. Letters from William, telling us he was happy, telling us he didn't love us anymore, telling us to stop looking." Elias stared at the letter. He didn't need to read it to know the handwriting. It was his own. Vane had made him write them. Cruel, necessary fictions to keep the family from asking questions, to paint William as a villain rather than a victim. "I learned to read from these lies," Clara whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracking through the dust on her cheek. "I memorized every loop, every slant. I hated the man who wrote them more than I hated the man who killed him. I thought," she paused, her voice breaking, "I thought if I ever found the hand that wrote these, I'd cut it off." Elias looked down at his own hands, the hands that had marked stalls and branded cattle, the hands that had written devastation into the lives of a widow and her child. He felt a shame so profound it threatened to stop his heart. He wasn't just a bystander, he was the architect of her suffering. He had provided the ink for the tragedy. "I can't bring him back, Clara," Elias said, his voice barely audible, a confession spoken to the wood grain of the table. "And I can't write the lies." "No," Clara answered, wiping her face with a fierce, jagged motion. "But you can help me prove they were lies. I don't want the gold, Elias. I don't care about the money buried in the ground. I want my name back. I want the town to know my father wasn't a thief. I want them to know he died trying to stop it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with a new understanding. Elias looked at the girl, no, the woman, sitting across from him. She was the innocent child the ledger had been protecting, grown up and hardened by the very cruelty he had helped inflict. He realized then that he couldn't just pay her off and send her away. The universe, in its cold irony, had delivered his penance to his doorstep. A wary truce began to knit itself together in the quiet kitchen, fragile as a spiderweb but strong enough to hold the weight of their shared danger. Elias slowly pushed the ledger back toward her. "If we do this," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its old steel, "Vane will come. He thinks this book is ash. When he finds out it's not, he won't bring lawyers. He'll bring fire." Clara placed her hand on the cover, her eyes locking with his, mirroring the resolve he had lost 20 years ago. "Let him come," she said. "I've been reading his secrets for a long time. I think it's time he read some of ours." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the sound of hoofbeats from the east, faint but unmistakable, closing the distance between the sins of the past and the reckoning of the present. The dawn broke not with the promise of a new day, but with the grim determination of a final stand. The light spilling over the ridges to reveal a ranch that was slowly transforming from a decaying relic into a fortress. The silence between Elias and Clara had shifted. It was no longer the jagged, uncomfortable quiet of strangers trapping each other in a web of suspicion, but the heavy, focused silence of soldiers digging a trench. They moved around the property with a synchronized urgency, the unspoken pact hanging in the air like the scent of ozone before a lightning strike. Elias knew his hands, twisted by arthritis and time, could no longer hold the line alone against a man like Silas Vane. Clara, in turn, understood that the ledger was useless without a witness, and her father's name would remain buried in the mud of history if Elias took a bullet before the truth could be told. This mutual necessity forged a bond stronger than blood, a fragile bridge built over a chasm of 20 years of lies. That evening, the bridge was solidified not with words, but with the simple, sacred act of breaking bread. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where the ledger had been opened like a wound the night before. Dinner was meager, cornbread and a stew made from the last of the salted beef, but the act of sharing it felt monumental. For the first time, Elias didn't need standing by the window, watching the horizon for threats. He sat opposite her. The steam rose from the bowls, curling in the lamplight, a visual metaphor of the barriers dissolving between them. There was no need for the minimalist dialogue to explain the shift. The clinking of spoons against ceramic and the passing of the salt cellar said everything that needed to be said. Elias looked at Claire and didn't see a drifter or a threat. He saw a partner. He saw the daughter he never had, inheriting a war she didn't start. The next morning, the education began. It was a trade, a barter of survival skills. Elias took her to the paddock, placing the heavy Colt Navy into her small hands. The weapon looked obscenely large against her frame, a tool of death held by fingers that were meant for mending and planting. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. Her focus was entirely on the cold iron in her grip. Elias stood behind her, his voice low and steady, instructing her not just on how to aim, but how to breathe. "It ain't about the ice," he rasped, adjusting her stance with a gentle touch that belied the violence he was teaching. "It's about the heart. You have to stop it from beating for just a second. You have to be colder than the metal." He watched as she struggled with the weight, the recoil of the first shot nearly knocking her off her feet, the bullet tearing harmlessly into the dirt 10 yards away. But she didn't drop it. She reset. She breathed. The second shot rang out, a crack that echoed off the canyon walls, and the tin can on the fence post spun wildly into the air. Elias felt a surge of pride that was instantly soured by a deep, bitter regret. He was corrupting her. He was taking the innocence that the ledger had been meant to protect and staining it with the gunpowder of his own past. He was turning a farmhand into a killer because he was too weak to do the killing himself. It was a moral dilemma that sat heavy in his gut, but when she turned to him, a fierce, grim satisfaction in her eyes, he nodded. It was necessary, but the teaching went both ways. At night, when the shutters were drawn and the fire burned low, Clara opened the ledger. This time, Elias didn't look away. She didn't read the numbers, she read the lives. She pointed to an entry from 1885, a payoff to the Miller family. To Elias, it had been a transaction, a line item to balance the books after a barn accidentally burned down to intimidate a witness. To Clara, it was a memory. The Millers didn't just lose a barn. She told him, her voice soft but unyielding. They lost their winter store. Mr. Miller hanged himself in the spring because he couldn't feed his children. His wife took in washing until her hands were raw, just to buy flour. She turned the page. The O'Malleys. You paid them for relocation. They died of fever on the trail to Oregon because the wagon you bought them had a rotted axle. Story after story, name after name, Clara breathed life into the ink. She took the abstract mathematics of Elias's sin and gave them faces, voices, and tragedies. Elias sat in his chair, the internal monologue of his guilt screaming louder than any accusation. He had spent 20 years telling himself he was just the accountant, that he hadn't pulled the trigger, that he wasn't a monster like Vane. But as Clara spoke, weaving a tapestry of suffering from his neat columns of figures, he realized the pen had been just as deadly as the sword. He wept then, not with sobbing heaves, but with a silent, leaking grief, a single tear tracking through the map of wrinkles on his face. The emotional tone in the room shifted from the sharp tension of survival to alternative, bittersweet hope. It was painful, this flaying of the soul, but it was also cleansing. Elias was finally looking at the wreckage he had helped create, and for the first time, he wasn't alone in the looking. Clara didn't offer forgiveness, that wasn't hers to give, but she offered understanding. She saw the man beneath the monster, the reluctant hero buried under layers of cowardice. They were two broken people trying to fix a broken world, sitting in the pool of light amidst the encroaching darkness. The pact was sealed not in blood, but in truth. They were ready. Not because they were strong, but because they finally knew exactly what they were fighting for. The ledger was no longer a book of debts, it was a manifesto of redemption, and they would carry it together, all the way to the end of the line. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. Elias forced a smile that felt like a grimace, stepping away from the trough but keeping his body angled toward the house, a subconscious block. Silas, he nodded, his voice dry. You're a long way from the comforts of town, Vane chuckled, a wet, rich sound, and swung down from the saddle with the grace of a man half his age. He dropped the reins, knowing the horse wouldn't wander. It was as disciplined as its master. Nostalgia, Elias. It's a terrible itch. I was riding the perimeter, thinking about the old days, thinking about Silver Creek. He walked toward the porch, his silver spurs chiming a delicate, deadly music. Inside the barn, 30 feet away, Clara froze. She had been oiling a bridle, the smell of leather and neat's foot oil filling her senses, when she heard the voice. It was the voice from her nightmares, the smooth baritone that had ordered her father's death in her imagination 1,000 times. She dropped to a crouch, slipping into the shadows of the rear stall, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared the sound would echo through the wooden walls. Through a knot in the pine siding, she watched the two men. One was the man who had saved her, the other was the wolf who had hunted her family. She saw Elias's hand twitch toward his hip, a reflex he instantly suppressed. He couldn't draw. Not here. Not with Vane standing so relaxed, his coat unbuttoned to reveal the ivory handle of a revolver that looked more like jewelry than a weapon. If Elias drew, Vane would kill him before the leather even cleared the holster. The dramatic irony was suffocating. The audience knew that Vane was there to assess, to sniff the air for rot, while Elias had to play the part of the lonely hermit, unaware that the girl hiding in the straw was the very thing Vane was hunting. "Come in, then," Elias said, stepping aside to let Vane onto the porch, the invitation tasting like poison. "I've got coffee. Stale, but hot." Vane wiped his boots on the scraper, a fastidious, mocking gesture, and stepped into the cool gloom of the ranch house. The transition from the blinding sun to the dark interior was jarring. Vane took off his hat, his eyes adjusting instantly, sweeping the room with the precision of a surveyor. He noted the dust on the mantel, the single plate in the sink, the shotgun leaning by the door. "You live like a monk, Elias," Vane mused, walking to the center of the room. "Penance? Or just poverty?" Elias poured the coffee, his hand steady only through sheer force of will. "Quiet suits me, Silas. The world got too loud." Vane took the tin cup, his fingers brushing Elias's, his skin cold despite the heat outside. "Quiet is expensive," Vane said softly, taking a sip and grimacing theatrically. "Silence costs more than gold, doesn't it? We both know that." He began to wonder, cup in hand, moving toward the hallway. Elias's heart stopped. The study. The ledger was locked away, but the room itself screamed of recent activity. "Where are you going, Silas?" Elias asked, his voice sharp, edging on panic. Vane paused, looking back over his shoulder with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking for the privy, old friend. Or has the plumbing failed you too?" Before Elias could answer, Vane pushed the door to the study open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, but a shaft of light from the hallway cut across the floor. Vane stood in the doorway, the silhouette of a predator framed in light. He didn't enter. He didn't need to. He looked down at the floorboards. There, stark against the dark wood, was a footprint. It wasn't a heavy, flat print of Elias's worn work boots. It was a small, narrow print, made by a boot with a fresh heel, outlined in the distinctive red clay mud of the riverbank, mud that hadn't been tracked in by an old man who hadn't left the porch in days. Vane stared at the print for a long, agonizing second. He tilted his head, a dog catching said. He knew. He didn't know who, and he didn't know why, but he knew Elias Slide. The slow burn of the past few weeks evaporated in that instant, replaced by the erratic, thumping rhythm of impending violence. Vane turned back to Elias, his face completely changed. The charm was gone, dripped away to reveal the shark-like blankness beneath. He took another sip of coffee, staring at Elias over the rim of the cup, his eyes flat and dead. "You know, Elias," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that carried more weight than a shout, "I always admired your solitude. It made you safe. But a man who keeps company is a man who has something to lose." Vane set the cup down on the hallway table with a deliberate clank. He walked back to the front door, his spurs chiming again, but the sound was no longer musical, it was a countdown. He stepped out onto the porch, the blinding sun reclaiming him. Elias followed, his hand hovering inches from his gun, sweat trickling down his spine. Vane mounted his horse in one fluid motion, gathering the reins. He looked down at Elias, and then, slowly, his gaze drifted past the old man, over his shoulder, fixing directly on the barn doors where Clara was hiding. He couldn't see her, but he looked right at the knot in the wood where her eye was pressed. He tipped his hat. "I'll be seeing you, Elias," Vane said, the promise hanging heavy in the stagnant air. "And I'll be back for what you're hiding. All of it." He turned the horse and spurred it, not into a trot, but into a gallop, tearing out of the yard as if the hounds of hell were at his heels. Elias stood frozen, watching the dust cloud rise, knowing that the truce with time was over. He turned and ran toward the barn, shouting Clara's name, as the silence of the valley was shattered not by wind, but by the deafening realization that the war had finally arrived. The wolf hadn't just knocked, he had marked the door, and next time, he would blow the house down. Night did not fall gently over the valley. It collapsed like him on shaft, sudden and absolute, choking the last breath of twilight under a heavy, suffocating blanket of obsidian. The air turned biting cold, a sharp contrast to the blistering heat of the afternoon, but Elias Thorne didn't feel the chill. He was burning with a fever of desperation, his shirt soaked through with sweat as he drove the spade into the hard-packed earth beneath the twisting roots of the ancient cottonwood that marked the southern boundary of his land. The lantern sat on a flat rock nearby, its wick turned high, the flame dancing violently in the wind and casting long, erratic shadows that looked like grasping skeletal hands clawing at the dig site. Clara worked beside him, not with the clumsy hesitation of a novice, but with a ferocious, rhythmic intensity that matched his own. She was using a pickaxe, swinging it with a grunt of exertion that tore from her throat, breaking the crust of the soil so Elias could shovel the debris aside. They were two grave robbers in reverse, frantically trying to exhume a corpse that had been buried for 20 years, not a body of flesh and bone, but a corpse of iron and gold. The ledger sat open on the rock next to the lantern, its pages fluttering, the coordinates 44 north, 12 west, beneath the shepherd's watch guiding their labor. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a chaotic drumbeat that drowned out the rasp of metal on stone. He knew Vane would return. The wolf had smelled the blood. It was only a matter of time before the pack arrived. They had to move the gold. If Vane got the money, he won. But if Elias could get the strongbox to the federal marshals in the capital, the ledger would be the key that locked Vane away forever. The hole was waist-deep when the spade finally hit something that wasn't rock or root. The sound was dull, a heavy thud that vibrated up the handle and into Elias's aching shoulders. He froze, his breath hitching. Clara stopped mid-swing, her eyes wide and reflecting the lantern light like polished obsidian. They fell to their knees, abandoning the tools, and began to claw at the dirt with their bare hands, fingernails tearing, ignoring the bite of the cold soil. Slowly, agonizingly, the shape revealed itself, a rusted iron corner, then a lid, then the heavy padlock that Elias himself had snapped shut 2 decades ago. It was the strongbox, the coffin of the Silver Creek legacy. Elias felt a wave of nausea roll over him. This was it, the physical manifestation of his cowardice. He reached for the keys on his belt, his fingers trembling so violently he dropped them twice before finally jamming the iron into the rusted mechanism. With a groan of protest, the lock gave way. Elias looked at Clara, a silent apology in his eyes for the burden he was about to reveal, and threw back the heavy lid. The lantern light flooded the interior of the box. Elias blinked, sure that the shadows were playing tricks on his aging eyes. He leaned closer, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp, pained wheeze. Empty. The box was completely, devastatingly empty. There were no canvas sacks of gold dust, no stacks of minted coins, just the rough, rusted bottom of the iron box and a single, solitary spider scuttling into the corner. Elias slumped back against the dirt wall of the pit, his strength evaporating instantly. "It's gone," he whispered, the words sounding like a death sentence. He found it. Vane found it. The despair was absolute. He had spent 20 years guarding a hole in the ground, sacrificing his life, his honor, and his peace of mind for absolutely nothing. He was a sentry standing guard over an empty vault. He covered his face with his dirty hands, the laughter bubbling up in his throat, a manic, broken sound. "We're dead, Clara. We're dead and there's nothing to bargain with." But Clara wasn't looking at the empty box with despair. She was staring at it with a terrifying, cold realization, her mind racing through the pages she had memorized, connecting dots that Elias had been too afraid to see. She reached into the box, not to find gold, but to touch the bottom. It was dry. "No," she said, her voice cutting through Elias's panic like a blade. "Vane didn't take it. If Vane had the gold, he wouldn't be riding a hired horse and asking questions in town. He wouldn't be hunting you." She stood up, towering over the pit, looking down at Elias. "Look at the ledger, Elias. Look at the last entry. The date." Elias looked at the book on the rock. The last entry wasn't a deposit. It was a note about a courier dispatch. "My father," Clara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and vindication. "He didn't steal the gold to keep it. He stole it to move it. He knew he was being framed. He hid the gold here. Yes, but he didn't just leave it. He mailed the location." She grabbed the ledger and held it up to the light. "He sent a letter to the sheriff of Silverton. Sheriff Miller, the man who swore to protect the town, Elias stared at her, the pieces slamming into place with the force of a freight train. William hadn't been a thief, he had been a whistleblower. He had trusted the law. But the law in Silverton had been bought a long time ago. The sheriff. Elias breathed, the horror dawning on him. Miller was the one who led the posse that hunted your father down. Miller was the one who declared the case closed. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face, fierce and hot. Miller intercepted the letter. He came here, dug up the gold himself, and then buried the empty box again to cover his tracks. He kept the money and let my father take the blame. And who is the sheriff now, Elias? Who took Miller's place when he retired to a mansion in the east? The answer hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Vane, Elias whispered. Silas Vane wasn't just an outlaw anymore. He was a deputy, the enforcer for a corrupt system that had been rotting the valley from the inside out for 20 years. The gold wasn't missing. It had been funding the very badge that Vane wore. The stakes shifted violently. This wasn't a treasure hunt anymore. It was a war against the institution itself. The empty box wasn't a failure. It was the smoking gun. It proved that the gold had been retrieved by someone who knew the location before the official investigation even started. It proved the conspiracy. Elias pulled himself out of the pit, the dirt falling from his clothes, his face hardening into a mask of stone. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold, burning fury that he hadn't felt since the war. He wasn't fighting for money. He wasn't even fighting for survival. He was fighting to tear down a 20-year lodge. We don't need the gold, Elias said, his voice low and dangerous, grabbing the shovel not as a tool, but as a weapon. We have the ledger, and now we know who the real thief is. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he didn't see a victim. He saw a witness. Vane is coming back, Elias stated, looking toward the dark horizon where the storm clouds were gathering again. And he's bringing the law. But this time, we're going to show them what justice actually looks like. The wind howled through the cottonwood branches, sounding less like a mournful cry and more like a battle hymn, as the old man and the young woman stood over the empty grave of their hopes, ready to fill it with the bodies of their enemies. The rumble began deep within the earth, a low-frequency tremor that vibrated through the soles of Elias's boots before the sound even reached his ears, a ghostly premonition of the violence thundering toward them. It wasn't the rhythmic, solitary cadence of Vane's earlier visit. This was a chaotic, dissonant stampede, the sound of a dozen horses tearing up the valley floor, their hooves beating a war drum against the hard-packed clay. Elias stood by the window of the darkened parlor, the Winchester rifle heavy in his hands, a weapon he had sworn never to lift against another man, now feeling like the only honest thing left in a world built on lies. Beside him, Clara crouched below the sill, clutching the Colt Navy with white-knuckled desperation, her eyes wide and reflecting the sliver of moonlight that sliced through the curtains. She wasn't the farmhand anymore. She was the target, the loose end that the approaching storm intended to sever. "They're not coming to talk, Clara," Elias murmured, his voice devoid of fear but heavy with a sorrow that felt ancient. "When the shooting starts, you stay low. You don't fire unless they breach the door. You understand?" She nodded, a sharp, jerky movement, as the first torch arced through the night sky like a fallen star, trailing sparks before crashing onto the dry porch roof. The wood, parched by weeks of drought, caught instantly, the flames licking upward with a hungry, crackling roar that shattered the night's camouflage. The siege didn't begin with a demand for surrender. It began with a volley of lead that shredded the silence in the front windows simultaneously. Glass exploded inward in a glittering shower, shards spraying across the floor like diamonds, followed by the dull thud of bullets biting into the heavy oak walls. Elias didn't flinch. He moved with the muscle memory of a soldier, a ghost from a war he thought he had left behind. He stepped into the gap, raised the Winchester, and fired. The action wasn't triumphant. It was sickeningly mechanical. The lever clicked, the brass casing spun through the air catching the firelight, and a shadow in the yard crumpled. Elias felt the weight of the soul he had just severed from the earth settle onto his own, adding to the burden he had carried for 20 years. This was the violence he had locked away in the ledger, the brutality he had tried to civilize with numbers and ink, now unleashed in its raw, bloody form. Every pull of the trigger was a failure, a testament to his inability to protect the peace he craved, yet he pulled it again and again, the rifle kicking against his bruised shoulder, a rhythmic punishment for his past sins. Outside, the world had transformed into a housecape of shifting shadows and blinding orange light. The fire on the roof was growing, casting a demonic glow over the yard, turning the attacking men into silhouettes that danced in and out of the darkness. Vane's voice drifted over the gunfire, calm and mocking, magnified by the flames. "Burn it down, boys. Flush the rats out." The heat was becoming oppressive, the air inside the house thickening with acrid smoke that stung the eyes and coated the throat. Clara was coughing, pressing a rag to her face, but she didn't retreat deep into the house. She crawled toward Elias, reloading the spent revolver cylinder he had tossed her, her hands steady despite the terror seizing her chest. She was part of this now, woven into the tapestry of violence by her father's legacy. A bullet punched through the wall inches from her head, sending a spray of splinters into her hair. Elias roared, a sound of pure, protective fury, and unleashed a rapid succession of shots that forced the attackers back behind the water trough. "We can't stay here," he yelled over the roar of the flames. "The roof is going to give. We have to make for the barn." But the path to the barn was a gauntlet of death, illuminated by the inferno consuming the porch. Vane knew it, too. The gunfire lulled, a tactical pause designed to lure them out. Elias looked at Clara, seeing the soot smeared on her cheek, the innocence burned away by the heat of the night. He grabbed her arm. "On my count, you run. I cover." It was a lie. He knew there was no cover thick enough to stop a dozen guns. He was preparing to spend his life, the last currency he had, to buy her a chance. 1, he counted, his grip tightening. 2, he kicked the back door open. 3, they burst out into the smoky night, the cool air hitting them like a physical blow before the heat of the fire wrapped around them again. The yard was chaos. Horses screamed, spooked by the fire, rearing and bucking. Bullets sifted past them like angry hornets, kicking up dirt at their feet. Elias fired wildly, suppressing the shadows near the corral, clearing a path. They were 10 yards from the barn when the visual narrative shifted in a heartbeat. From the periphery of his vision, Elias saw it, a glint of metal on the silo roof, a sniper Vane had positioned for exactly this moment. The rifle was tracking not Elias, but Clara. The angle was perfect, the shot was inevitable. Time seemed to warp, stretching the second into an eternity. Elias didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds or weigh the consequences. He simply acted. He threw his body weight into Clara, shoving her hard to the right, into the dirt behind a stack of hay bales, and stepped into the space she had occupied a millisecond before. The sound of the shot was distinct, a sharp crack that sounded different from the chaotic volley. The impact took Elias in the chest, high on the right side, spinning him around with the force of a sledgehammer. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs, the sky above him spinning in a dizzying vortex of smoke and stars. Pain didn't come immediately, only a cold, numbing shock that radiated from his shoulder down to his fingertips. He tried to lift the Winchester, but his arm refused to obey. He looked up to see Clara scrambling toward him, screaming a name he couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Blood was pooling in the dust, black in the moonlight, soaking into the dry earth that he had failed to farm but succeeded in defending. He had been a coward for 20 years, hiding behind a ledger, letting a dead man take the blame for a crime he watched happen. But in this moment, lying in the dirt with a hole in his chest, Elias Thorne wasn't a coward. He was the shield. He watched Clara's face hover over him, terrified and fierce, and he forced a grim, bloody smile. He had finally balanced the books. The debt wasn't paid in full yet, but the down payment had been made in blood. "Go," he wheezed, the word bubbling up through the red foam on his lips. "Get the horses." He wasn't dead, not yet. The old wolf still had teeth, and as he fumbled for the revolver at his waist with his good hand, he knew the night was far from over. The siege had broken the house, but it hadn't broken them. It had only forged them into something harder, something sharp enough to cut the throat of the past. The bullet in Elias's chest didn't burn. It froze, a jagged shaft of winter lodged deep between his ribs, radiating a numbness that was slowly, methodically shutting down the machinery of his body. He lay on the straw of the barn, the air thick with the smell of old dust and fresh copper blood, watching the frantic, terrified movements of Clara as she tried to tear the hem of her dress to make a bandage. Her hands were slick with his life, trembling so violently she couldn't find the purchase to tear the fabric. Elias reached up, his grip weak but insistent, and stilled her hands. The connection was electric, a final current passing between the old man who had wasted his life and the young woman who was just beginning hers. "Stop," he wheezed, the word bubbling up through a throat constricted by pain and smoke. "There's no time for patching holes, girl. The dam has already broke." He gestured to the kerosene lantern hanging on the post above them, the flame flickering wildly as the gunfire outside intensified, turning the wooden walls into a sieve. The barn was dry as a bone, a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and Elias knew exactly what he had to do. It was the only card he had left to play, a scorched earth gambit to buy the one thing more valuable than gold: time. He reached into his coat, his fingers fumbling past the sticky wetness of his shirt, and pulled out the letter. It felt heavy, heavier than it ever had, weighted down by 20 years of silence and the ghosts of the men whose names were inscribed within. He pressed it into Clara's chest, his eyes locking onto hers with a ferocious intensity that burned through the haze of his dying vision. "Take it," he commanded, his voice finding a sudden, jagged strength. "Go out the back, through the creek bed. Don't stop until you see the marshal's badge." Clara shook her head, tears cutting tracks through the suit on her face. "I won't leave you," she sobbed, the refusal torn from her soul. "I can't." Elias looked at her, his expression softening, the reluctant hero finally shedding the last of his armor. "You aren't leaving me, Clara," he whispered. "You're carrying me. Every name in that book. That's me. You saved them. You saved me." With a groan that sounded like timber snapping, Elias rolled onto his side and kicked the lantern. The glass shattered, a crystalline chime amidst the chaos, and the oil splashed across the dry straw. The fire didn't start tentatively. It roared to life instantly, a hungry, orange beast that leapt up the walls and licked at the rafters. The dark-to-light transition was violent and absolute. The shadows in the barn were incinerated by a blinding, hellish glow. "Go," Elias roared, the heat searing his face. Clara looked at him one last time, a look of anguish and promise, before clutching the ledger to her chest and vanishing into the darkness of the rear stall, slipping out the back way just as the roof began to groan under the assault of the flames. Elias was alone. He grabbed the stall door and held himself upright, his legs shaking, his vision swimming. He wasn't fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for an exit. He stumbled toward the main doors, the heat in his back pushing him forward, a physical force. He kicked the doors open and stepped out into the yard. The scene that greeted him was apocalyptic. The house was a smoldering ruin, but the barn was now a towering inferno, painting the night sky in violent strokes of orange and black. In the center of the yard, bathed in the flickering, demonic light, stood Silas Vane. He had dismounted, his pistol drawn, watching the fire with a look of confusion that was slowly curdling into realization. He saw Elias emerge from the flames, a silhouette of ragged determination, swaying but standing. Vane didn't fire immediately. He was paralyzed by the sight, the man he thought he had broken, standing in the mouth of hell, refusing to fall. Elias limped forward, his boots dragging in the dust, the Winchester gone, only the Colt Navy hanging heavy in his hand. He stopped 10 paces from Vane. The heat was intense, singeing the hair on their arms, the roar of the fire drowning out the distant thunder. "You look like a dead man, Elias," Vane shouted over the noise, his voice tight. The charm finally burned away. "Why didn't you just stay down?" Elias looked at his old partner, seeing not the monster, but the small, greedy man beneath the suit. "Because the ledger is gone, Silas," Elias rasped, the words carrying across the distance. "And you're never going to touch it." Vane's eyes widened. He glanced at the barn, then back at Elias. The realization hit him. The fire wasn't a surrender, it was a wall. "You burned it?" Vane screamed, a sound of pure, avaricious horror. "You burned the money?" "I burned the lie," Elias replied, raising the Colt. His arm wavered, the weight of the gun immense. "All for nothing, Silas. 20 years of blood. For dirt." Vane's face twisted. The loss of the gold hurt him more than a bullet ever could. "It wasn't for nothing," Vane hissed, raising his own weapon, the firelight dancing in his eyes like madness. "It was for a kingdom. And I'm still the king." The dialogue was spearing, stripped to the bone. There were no speeches, just the raw, ugly truth of two men at the end of the world. Vane cocked the hammer. Elias did the same. The moment stretched, suspended in the amber light of the fire. Then, the dawn began to break. Not the sun, but the realization in Elias's eyes that he didn't need to survive this. He just needed to stop Vane. Vane fired first. The bullet struck Elias in the shoulder, spinning him, but he didn't go down. He used the momentum, turning back, the Colt leveled. He didn't aim for the head or the heart, he aimed for the man. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was a thunderclap that silenced the wind. Vane jerked, a look of profound surprise on his face as a dark blossom opened on his chest. He dropped to his knees, the king of the valley crumbling into the dust, his revolver falling from his hand. He looked up at Elias, his mouth opening to speak, but only blood came out. He fell forward, face down in the dirt he had tried to own. Elias stood for a heartbeat longer, the victor of the war no one would remember. Then, the strings that held him up were cut. He collapsed, hitting the ground hard, the dust puffing up around him. The pain was gone now, replaced by a cold, creeping tide. He rolled onto his back. The barn was still raging, a pillar of fire, but beyond the smoke, the sky was changing. The deep, bruising purple of the night was softening into a bruised gray. The dark-to-light transition was complete. The fire was the dying gasp of the night. The gray light on the horizon was the promise of the morning. Elias stared up at the sky, his breath coming in shallow, rattling hiccups. He thought of the ledger. He thought of Clara running through the creek bed. He thought of the innocent child who would finally know the truth. He closed his eyes, listening to the fire crackle, sounding less like destruction and more like applause. He had hired a farmhand, but he had found his salvation. And as the first true ray of the sun crested the ridge, illuminating the smoke with a golden halo, Elias Thorne finally stopped counting the cost. The ledger was closed. The debt was paid. The valley was silent again, waiting for the new day. The smoke from the burning barn didn't clear for 3 days, hanging over the valley like a gray shroud of mourning. But when it finally lifted, it revealed a world that had been scrubbed clean by fire and truth. The U.S. Marshal, a man with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's cruelty, arrived not with a posse of gunslingers, but with a team of federal investigators. He found Clara sitting on the steps of the ruined porch, the ledger resting on her knees like a shield. She didn't have to speak, the book spoke for her. The pages, smelling of smoke and old sins, dismantled a 20-year empire of corruption in an afternoon. The names in Elias's jagged handwriting weren't just numbers anymore. They were indictments. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless, tearing through the rod of Silverton like a surgeon's scalpel. The sheriff's badge was stripped, the corrupt judges were unseated, and the network that Silas Vane had killed to protect was dragged into the unforgiving light of justice. But the true cost of that freedom was etched into the soil of the ranch itself. The seasons turned, as they always do, indifferent to the tragedies of men. Winter came with its white silence, burying the blackened scars of the barn under heavy drifts of snow, and then spring arrived, violent and green, pushing life up through the ashes. 1 year later, the valley didn't look like a graveyard anymore. It looked like a garden. The ranch house had been rebuilt, not as a fortress against the world, but as a home. The timber was new, smelling of pine and sap, and the windows were wide and clear, no longer shuttered against the past. Clara stood on the porch, not in the oversized dress of a drifter, but in the sturdy, practical clothes of a landowner. Elias hadn't just left her a mission, he had left her a legacy. A simple will, filed with the very bank her father had supposedly robbed, named her the sole beneficiary of the Thorne estate. It was his final apology, a way of returning the life he had helped steal from her family. But the deed to the land wasn't the only thing he had left. Clara walked down the porch steps, the morning sun warm on her face, and made her way up the winding path to the hillside that overlooked the valley. There, beneath the shade of an ancient oak that had survived the fire, stood a simple headstone. It didn't bear a long epitaph, just a name and dates, and the inscription, "He finally balanced the books." Claire knelt in the grass, the wind playing with the hem of her skirt, and pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was the letter she had found tucked inside the back cover of the ledger, written in a hand that was shaky but determined, the last words of a man who knew he wouldn't see the sunrise. Her voice was steady as she read it aloud to the silence of the hills, a conversation between the living and the dead. "Clara," the letter began, the words echoing in her mind with Elias's graphed amber. "I thought I was hiring a farmhand because my back was weak. I didn't know I was hiring a daughter because my soul was empty. You looked at that ledger and saw a monster, and you were right. But you stayed. You didn't run. And because you stayed, I remembered who I was supposed to be before the world got so loud. Do not mourn the fire, and do not mourn me. The gold was never the treasure, girl. The truth was the treasure, and you are the only one strong enough to carry it. Keep the fences mended, keep the ledger closed, and never let the silence get too heavy in that house again. Yours, Elias." Clara folded the letter, her fingers brushing the ink, and a single tear traced the path of the old scars on her soul. It wasn't a tear of grief, it was a tear of release. The bitterness that had fueled her for so long had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, enduring peace. She looked down at the ranch, the restored house gleaming in the sunlight, the cattle grazing in the lower pasture, the smoke rising from the chimney, not the black smoke of destruction, but the white, lazy smoke of a hearth fire, the blood money that had been paid. It hadn't been settled with the stolen gold of Deadwood, which remained lost to history, but with something far more valuable. It had been paid with courage. It had been paid with the truth. Clara stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, and looked out at the horizon where the sky met the earth in a seamless line of blue and gold. She was no longer the girl reading a private ledger in the dark. She was the author of her own story now. The camera of our mind's eye pulls back slowly, rising above the hillside, widening its view to encompass the woman, the grave, and the Rayborn Ranch below, a trinity of redemption carved out of the wild frontier. And as the image fades, we are left with a question that echoes longer than any gunshot. When the final page of your life is written, and the ledger is closed, will you be remembered for what you kept, or for what you gave away? If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.